The first thing Phineas noticed was the silence. Not the gradual kind, where conversation dies room by room, like candles being snuffed. This was instantaneous. One moment, the Aldenmere Winter Ball was everything it was supposed to be. Crystal, candlelight, 200 bodies generating the specific warm noise of aristocratic performance. And the next, nothing. As if the air itself had made a decision. Phineas Crane was nobody important. Third secretary to the Earl of Vestmarch, which meant he carried letters and stood near walls and learned, over years of careful standing, to read a room the way a sailor reads water. He was good at it. He knew the difference between silence that meant scandal and silence that meant danger. This was the second kind. He turned toward the far end of the ballroom, where the crowd had done something strange. They hadn't parted, not exactly. It was more that a circle had formed, the way iron filings orient around a magnet. 80 men, perhaps more, all facing inward, all very still. At the center of the circle stood the Duke of Carath. Phineas had seen Gideon Aldrich Voss, Duke of Carath, exactly twice before tonight. Once at a parliamentary convening, where Voss had said 9 words in 4 hours, and somehow made those 9 words the only ones anyone remembered. Once at a funeral, where Voss had stood apart from the other mourners with the particular stillness of a man who did not need other people to bear weight. He was not a large man. That was what struck you first, then embarrassed you for noticing. He was lean, dark-haired, somewhere in his late 30s, with the kind of face that wasn't handsome so much as final, like a sentence that doesn't require punctuation because it simply ends and you understand. He wore no decorations tonight. No sash, no ceremonial chain, no signal of rank. Just black, severe, and total against the blazing chandelier light. His eyes were on Lord Joab Fenwick. Fenwick was large in the way that men who have never been told no tend to be large. Expansive, taking up space that wasn't offered. He was third in line to the Hesmore Marquisate, which meant he had enough status to be dangerous and not quite enough to be untouchable. He'd been drinking since the second hour. Phineas had watched him work the room with the cheerful aggression of a man who confused fear with affection. The woman stood between them. Phineas didn't know her name yet. He would learn it later. Miriam Ashcroft, daughter of the late Baron Sedwell, now ward of the Crown, present tonight under the formal escort of the Duchess of Lorne, who had abandoned her to the punch table 40 minutes ago. She was young. Not as young as Fenwick had probably hoped, but young enough that her stillness read as uncertainty rather than refusal, and men like Fenwick had made careers out of that distinction. Her dress was pale gold. Her dark hair was pinned, one loose strand crossing her jaw. She was not looking at Fenwick. She was looking at the floor with the focused attention of someone performing calm the way an actor performs grief. Technically correct. Deeply exhausting. Fenwick's hand was on her arm, not violently. That was the precise ugliness of it. His grip was social, proprietary, the kind that looks like an escort from any distance but feels, at the point of contact, like a claim being filed. He had been steering her. Phineas had watched it happen over the last 10 minutes, the gentle, inexorable redirection, away from the populated center of the room, toward the eastern corridor where the light was different, and no one's secretary stood against the wall. It was at the moment Fenwick's hand shifted from her elbow to the bare skin above it that the Duke of Carath spoke. He didn't raise his voice. That was the first impossible thing. "Take your hand off her." 4 words. Flat, conversational, the volume of a man asking for salt. But the room had heard it. The room had felt it, in whatever way rooms feel things, through the floor, through the vibration of chandeliers, through 80 sets of lungs collectively making the choice not to exhale. Fenwick turned. His expression cycled through its options. Surprise first, genuine, unguarded, because men like Fenwick were always genuinely surprised when named. Then the calculation, quick and visible, as he placed the voice and found the face and ran the social arithmetic. Carath, Duke. The Voss estate, the Voss seat in the north, the Voss name which appeared in 4 separate founding charters of the realm. The number came up. Even drunk, it came up. He let go of Miriam's arm, but he didn't step back. That was his mistake. He let go and he smiled, the particular smile of a man trying to reassign a moment to comedy. "Your Grace," he said. "I wasn't aware the lady was spoken for. If you're enjoying the story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment." There it was, the social exit, the offered door. All Voss had to do was accept the framing, allow the misunderstanding to be the story, allow Fenwick to be merely uninformed rather than deliberately ignoring the woman's visible discomfort, and the moment would dissolve into ballroom air like all such moments did. That was how these things worked. That was the machinery. Voss didn't touch it. "I didn't speak of ownership," he said. "I spoke of your hand." Fenwick's smile held, but its quality changed. Shorter, tighter at the corners. Around the circle, 80 men who had spent their entire lives learning to read tonal shifts in powerful rooms underwent simultaneous recalibration. Phineas watched it happen. Watched a Lord Cassius Hearn, who was 3 places above Fenwick in the social architecture and had been studying his cufflinks, look up. Watched 2 younger barons near the fireplace take a single synchronized step backward. Not dramatic, just enough. "I meant no offense," Fenwick said. "To anyone. That is not the same as having caused none." Simple sentence. No heat in it. Phineas had seen magistrates pass sentence with more emotional inflection. But what it did to the room, to the shape of the room, to the orientation of 80 bodies in formal wear, was architectural. The circle tightened on one side and expanded on another, and what had been a vague cluster of curious onlookers quietly became an audience, and what had been an audience quietly became a court. Lord Hearn took a full step back now, not away from anything in particular, just back, just redefining his position relative to what was happening. Fenwick felt it. Men like him always felt it. The social gravity shifting, the mass of the room reconsidering its center. His color changed, not pale, not yet, more like a clarification, like a photograph resolving from blur. "Your Grace," he said, and the title came out slightly different this time, slightly slower, a lever he was working rather than a formality he was extending. "The lady and I were simply, I know what you were doing." The silence after that was a different texture than the one before it. Before, the room had been quiet with attention. Now, it was quiet with something else, with the held breath of people watching a negotiation fail. Fenwick laughed. Actually laughed, short, sharp, a sound that was meant to be dismissive and instead rang false against the crystal and the quiet. "You know," he said, the register of his voice dropping into something he probably imagined was equal. "For a man with no declared interest in the lady, you've made a considerable entrance." And there it was. The countermove. Phineas recognized it. Everyone in the room recognized it. Fenwick was doing what cornered men with enough status always do. He was rewriting the scene, making Voss the aggressor, making the protection look like possession, making a question out of the Duke's own motivation. It was not an unintelligent move. Voss looked at him for a long moment, then, touch her again. Not a question, not a threat phrased as a question. 2 words, flat and even, carrying the absolute syntactic weight of a conditional with its second half simply removed. The second half didn't need to be said because in this room, in this century, with this man saying it, the consequence was not a mystery. It lived in the air. Everyone breathed it. Touch her again. Fenwick did not move. Around him, the circle continued its quiet reformation. Lord Hearn was now standing behind two other men. The barons near the fireplace had completed their step. 3 members of the Vestmarch delegation, Phineas's own employers, technically, had found reasons to be interested in the far end of the room. Even Cassius Hearn's brother, who had spent the last 10 years publicly feuding with the Voss estate over a river boundary, was occupying himself carefully with his champagne in a direction that was not forward. 80 men. Phineas counted later when he wrote it down. 80 men in a room rearranging themselves around a single sentence. It wasn't fear, exactly. Or it wasn't only fear. That was what took Phineas the rest of the evening to understand, standing against his wall, watching the aftermath unspool. It wasn't that 80 noblemen were frightened of Gideon Voss. Some of them were, certainly. But most of them, the ones who mattered, the ones whose step backward was the one that made the others step backward, they were doing something more complex and more revealing. They were agreeing. They were saying, with their bodies and their silence and their careful champagne, yes, this is the line, and we are on this side of it. Fenwick was now on the other side alone. He understood it. Phineas watched him understand it. Watched the understanding move through him the way weather moves, first distant, then overhead, then everywhere at once. The social calculus had completed itself. He was not about to be physically harmed. He was going to be socially dismantled, slowly, by every man in this room choosing, over the following weeks and months and invitations, not to be standing near him. That was how it worked in these circles. That was in many ways worse. He stepped back. Once, deliberately. A step that was trying very hard to be his own idea. "Your Grace," he said, and the title was neither lever nor formality now. It was just accurate. "I'll leave you to your evening." He turned and walked toward the eastern corridor he had been steering Miriam toward, alone, and the crowd allowed him through without parting, which is different from parting, which means he had to compress himself between people who did not move, and every inch of that walk was its own small sentence. Nobody watched him go. That was the final cruelty, the specific genius of how these rooms worked. Nobody watched because it was already over. Voss turned. Not to the crowd, not to acknowledge what had just happened, not to receive what the room was now silently offering, the deference, the recognition, the retroactive enrollment of 80 witnesses in his story. He turned toward Miriam. She had not moved during any of it, had stood with her pale gold dress and her loose strand of hair and her very careful expression, holding still in the way that women who are accustomed to being the occasion of confrontations rather than participants in them learn to hold still. Present and absent simultaneously, the way a painting is present in a room. She looked up when he turned. He said something to her. Phineas was too far to hear it. He saw Voss's face in three-quarter profile, saw the absolute economic stillness of his expression, and whatever he said, it was short. 4 words, maybe 5, and it was, for the first time in the entire scene, not a public statement, not a sentence that required the room. It went from him to her and stopped. Her expression changed. It was small. The change was very small. But Phineas was a man who had spent years learning to read rooms, and he saw it. The fraction of a shift, the almost imperceptible softening at her jaw, the very slight reorganization of her eyes, as though she was adjusting to a new distance. She said something back. Voss listened. Nodded once, the small precise nod of a man confirming information, and then he offered her his arm, not a claim, not a steering, just an arm, offered, her decision what to do with it. She took it. They walked toward the main floor, toward the light and the resumed music and the 200 people who were loudly, deliberately, performing the act of having been looking elsewhere. The circle had dissolved. The room had rearranged itself back to something resembling its previous configuration, the way water rearranges after a stone. But the stone had passed through. Nothing was the same temperature it had been before. Phineas stayed against his wall. He would write this down tonight, in the small leather journal he kept not for posterity but for himself, because he had learned that witnessing things carefully was the only power available to men in his position. He would try to describe it accurately. He would try to explain what it was he had watched. He would not, in the end, quite manage it. What he would write, what he would settle on, after crossing out 4 other attempts, was this. The room did not change because it was forced to. It changed because 80 men looked at one and saw, in him, what they had all agreed to want in themselves, and found the wanting easier than the having. Carath said 4 words, and the hall reformed around them not out of fear, but out of recognition. He named the line, and they remembered they believed in it. Fenwick walked out. The lady took the Duke's arm. The music resumed. Nobody spoke of it directly. They will speak of nothing else for years. Phineas closed his journal and pocketed his pen. Across the room, the Duke of Carath was standing near the tall east windows with Miriam Ashcroft, not dancing, not performing, simply present in the resumed noise of the evening. Someone was already moving toward them. Lord Aldrich Marsh. Powerful, careful, a man who had not taken a social step without calculation in 30 years. He was moving toward the Duke with the unhurried certainty of a man adjusting his position in a landscape that had quietly, irrevocably changed. Voss saw him coming. His expression did not change. His arm, where Miriam's hand rested, did not move. He simply watched Marsh approach with the level patience of a man who already knew what the other man had come to say. Not the words, but the meaning underneath them, the only meaning that mattered tonight. I see where the weight is. I'm standing near it. Marsh arrived. He bowed. Voss received it without performance, without pleasure, without the slightest adjustment of his bearing, as if it were simply correct, as if the room had found its proper geometry at last, and this, Marsh bowing, Miriam present, the eastward corridor empty, 80 men scattered back into the evening wearing the particular expression of people who know they have been part of something, was what that geometry looked like. Miriam's hand remained on his arm. The chandeliers burned. The music played on.